Welcome to High Stakes, Episode 8. I'm your host, Neil Orfield, and my guest today is that monster we've been warning you about. Came out of nowhere in 2019. He's got simulators, he's an originator, and he's just been crushing just about every sport for the past couple of years. His name on Twitter is nerdytenor. His name on DraftKings is nerdytenor. FanDuel, he's Purple Octopus. Daniel, how are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Are you planning on playing some golf this weekend?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you're gonna play golf, you got to play this one. So
Yeah, that's.
I definitely upping my volume up quite a bit, actually.
Oh yeah, are you playing like all the high stakes stuff and all the different? I mean, there's I believe 4 milli makers.
I'm playing the big $15 one. I think that's the only milli maker I'm winning, but I'm doing a couple high stakes things and then bunch of qualifiers for fun. I have a small budget for that, so I figured this is a good one to load up on. So
Nice. Yeah, it's a fun week. Everybody's talking about it. I'm not big into PGA DFS. I've been getting into it more this year, but it's pretty exciting when everybody's talking about it. It's all over Twitter. Everybody's talking about who they're going to play. Everybody has like hot takes left and right. So I'm excited to play as well.
the thing I'm really excited about is baseball starting up again.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you are.
That's really a thrill. I mean,
Me too.
It's just so much more civilized than NBA DFS.
So let's talk about that. So we're jumping ahead a little bit, but I don't believe you've been playing NBA DFS Classic slates. Is that the case?
Well, that was true in the past. So there's a funny story there. I generally focused on slates where late swap is not an issue. So Showdown and Turbos, and if a main slate happened to have like those weird slates where there's like 3 games at 5:30 for whatever reason on a Thursday, like those I would play. But I might have mentioned this in the past online. My simulations did not show much of a winning result at all when I ran my backtesting for those. And the reason I avoided main slates is because I have family and I want to see them once in a while. And you know, as you well know, if you're going to play NBA, you just have to be in front of your computer. You know, my son's a little older now and busy with his own stuff, and so I've dipped my toes into that this year, and it's been quite successful. So I'm still trying to figure out what to make of it, but I suspect what's happening there is that my process is maybe close to break even or slightly losing for contests without late swap. But once you add late swap, it's such a huge edge. Or put another way, not utilizing late swap is such a big leap.
Right.
That's enough to put me into the plus. Even though, you know, I talked about this on Jordan's podcast. Like I also avoided the main slates because I don't have an automated way of doing late swap intelligently.
Right.
And so I just made a decision like it's never going to be perfect, but so I wrote some tools for myself to simplify it, but it's still kind of ad hoc. I mean, I'm making human decisions. Horror, right? Just not my wheelhouse, but I maybe that's enough for me to win. The combination of my
Sounds
software,
like it is.
yeah, I mean, but I don't know. We'll see.
That's interesting. So I had thought that you played NBA DFS. Like I feel like I've been seeing your name all over the place still. And then I rewatched your interview with Jordan, and you mentioned that you didn't play classic NBA slates unless it was like a late night one where you didn't have to worry about late swap. So then I looked at your results recently, and I didn't see any recent results from main slate. So I thought, he must still not be doing it, but it must be that they just hadn't updated yet.
Yeah, I banked one on FanDuel for 100K.
That's right, Purple Octopus. Yeah.
But that one was a 2-gamer, so that does not really prove the point. But then I think DK on a more normal main slate that had a lot of late swap action, I got 2nd and 5th or something.
Yep.
On a big one. So it's still too small a sample to know. I mean, but You're
giving it a shot.
I'm giving it a shot. I still suspect I won't do a lot of it. It's just a ton of work, and it's a pain in the ass.
So have you been playing every day on both DraftKings and FanDuel, like on the main slates?
Not for NBA. I've been picking and choosing. like if there's anything remotely interesting happening that I could be doing otherwise, I'll do that instead.
Okay.
Like if we want to go out to dinner with friends, I'm doing that. If my son wants to watch a show, we're doing that. But like
Okay.
it's sort of opportunistic because I'm not super confident in my edge there. Well, I should
Okay.
restate. I'm not super confident that I have an edge after the rake,
Right.
which
Okay.
is like pretty much everything I've ever attempted in DFS has very quickly been above average relative to the field.
Yep.
But as you know, that's not even close to enough to win, right? You have to be top 95, 93% just to break even, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's a tough game. I'm confident that you will be able to beat the rake long term, but I want to save talking about your process. So now that's something I'm going to add to when we're talking about your process. Now I want to hear about your late swap process because I was working under the assumption that you weren't doing it, and that's obviously a pretty fascinating part of anybody's process, but in particular your process because you're doing simulations and that obviously stuff changes after the first lock when you need to do late swap. So I'm really interested in hearing about that, but let's save it and start the more classical way and talk about your background just a little bit. I'm sure people have already kind of gotten a feel for what kind of player you are just based on these first 5 minutes. We've been talking 10 minutes, whatever it's been. But let's get into your background a little bit. So what kind of background do you have in statistics? Are you formally trained or informally trained?
So I don't think I ever took stats, but I do have training in computer science as a computer science major. So I have some math. I don't have a ton. I always wish I had more math than I do. My brother is actually a math professor.
Wow.
Yeah, but I'm not a mathematician or a computer scientist, really. I'm more like a programmer with pretensions. Like I try to use those things as tools. Like I'm not really good at reading math or computer science papers, but I'll force myself to get through them, and I can do it if I really have to.
Okay.
I'm just
So are you a hands-on learner then, would you say? I mean, is it kind of like what you learn once you need to learn how to do something, you can figure it out then, or?
yeah. I think I have enough. I have just enough knowledge of math and computer science to know where to look for things.
Okay.
So it's not so much that I have the answers myself, but I'm like, this problem, surely somebody's figured out a way to convert this kind of distribution into something else, or how to sample this fairly, or all sorts of stuff. So I end up like reading math papers and skimming snippets of code online that I just kind of barely understand enough that I can incorporate it myself,
Okay.
I would say.
Yeah. So you
And
learn
then,
what you need to learn.
yeah, and then I do a fair bit of, frankly, what you would call research, where I just try stuff out. I've written tons of code that I've thrown away, tons and tons and tons, thousands and thousands of lines of stuff. I'm like, oh, this is a really cool idea, and then I back test it, and it's worse than the thing I already had, or there's literally no difference. That happens a lot. So
Okay. And you say, so I was going to ask next whether you have formal or informal training in computer programming. I think you just said you were a computer science major.
yes, computer science and singing was I was a double major.
Oh,
So
double major. Okay.
yeah, I started actually as a music student at a conservatory and as a singer. And after the first year, I was a little bored. So I added the computer science major, which I always kind of tinkered with that stuff. So
Yeah, you said on the Theory of DFS, you were a guest on the Theory of DFS podcast, that you would sometimes you'd do computer science, and then when you got bored of that, you just go back to singing and kind of go back and forth. Is that still the case? Like, do you go back and forth?
yeah, I
Yeah.
do. And in
Okay.
fact, yesterday I just had a rehearsal last night in Boulder for concerts that are in a few weeks.
You say in Boulder?
Yeah, so
You're in Colorado?
I live in Denver, but yeah, for whatever reason, I have 4 singing gigs in April and May. It
That's
just
awesome.
happened that way all at once. So 3 of them are out here, and 1 is in Sonoma. And then so yeah, I have done various amounts of both. I've been full-time software, full-time singer. Right now, it's probably about 85-15. tech stuff and music stuff.
Yeah. Okay. That's
Although these
interesting.
next 2 months, it's going to be closer to 50-50.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that there are a lot of DFSers in Colorado, so you should post your schedule for when you're going to be singing. Maybe some DFSers will come out and see you.
I will do. I'll
Do it
try
on
to
Twitter.
inject some culture into these.
We could use it. Us DFSers, we don't have much culture. Nice.
Yeah.
And do you, so at this point, do you consider yourself a DFS pro? Like I think of you as being a DFS pro. Do you think that's your primary occupation at this point?
Strangely, it is right now. I think what happened was, so my main tech job for the past few years has been writing custom poker software for various serious players.
You say that the last few years, like, 2019, 2021, you've been still
Yeah,
doing
actually,
poker software?
I am, but in 2020, by 2020, mid-pandemic, I was kind of burned out. I still am a little. So the people I work for are very flexible, which is great. Various people, and so I'm doing that sort of quarter time now, and then the rest of my time has been DFS and music, depending on what's happening. So yeah, I guess I am like a 3/4 time DFS pro or something like it.
Do you still sell your pro poker tools? You talked about that a little bit on
I
Jordan's
do.
podcast.
I make a small amount of money each year on that. I feel bad because I haven't updated it in years. And I can never keep up with customer emails because I have so many other things going on. So, but yeah, people still use it and it's still useful.
I saw that you posted some videos on your YouTube. I searched a little bit and found
some
little tutorials, really short
those are
tutorials
ancient, yeah,
on YouTube. They were from like 2011, I want to say. Like, they were pretty ancient. I didn't end up watching them. The first one didn't have sound, or maybe my sound wasn't working.
I did some like silent videos for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I can't remember why.
That's funny. Yeah. So you have a background in poker, which is pretty common in DFS. I don't come from a poker background. Is that kind of how you got started with DFS? You come from poker. A lot of poker players moved on from DFS. I know that's kind of how Alex Baker got started. When did you start getting involved with DFS, and what drew you in?
So there are two phases. The first phase was somebody I had worked, an elite poker pro I'd worked with on another project, which went really well and then kind of finished. It was very successful. And he said, there's this DFS thing and there's tons of money. And so he lives in Europe. So I flew out there and met with him and some other people I know from this project. And it was kind of fun, actually. I'm not a super big sports guy, but they were looking at the NFL. And so like, we're watching games and I'm like explaining the rules to them as we're watching. I ultimately decided not to do that, which feels terrible now in retrospect. But I just had too many other things going on. They went on to give it a go, and I wasn't involved, so I'm not quite sure what happened. So
you mentioned on Jordan's podcast that they were essentially trying to do ownership projections. Like that was kind of the early stages of doing something along those lines that you decided not to get involved with.
Yeah, something like that. It's not really any of my business. I think that's what they were doing. Anyway, that kind of planted the seed, but I didn't do anything. And then I'm looking at my records here. I can see like a few $1 entries from 2015. That's from that. We put in a few like little entries so we could sweat football together, basically.
Nice.
So scroll ahead a few years later, I don't even remember what my motivation was, but in 2017 or so, I started dorking around with micro stakes NFL tiers. So I'm like, oh, this is just kind of a fun thing. I'm like, I wonder if I can whip something together like the problem space, or the number of possible lineups is so low that I'm like, I can model this like easily. Like I can generate all the lineups, and I'll take some public projections and I'll slice and dice. And I did something relatively unsophisticated, and I tweaked it. I tried a few things. This is like spread out over like a year, like putting in a few hours here and then doing nothing for a few months and then trying again. And then I got something. I'm like, hey, this is actually winning. And I realized that the key thing that I realized early is that on DraftKings, the ability to download the CSV after the contest is over allows you to do all sorts of analysis after the fact. say, oh, what would have happened if I had done this strategy instead of this strategy? What would have happened if I took this approach versus that? So that loop of like enter contests, write code, backtest, improve, repeat over and over, like that's sort of that's entirely, it's the same thing as developers, software developers say you have a code test loop. Like you write a little thing and then you test it and then you write the next thing, and it gets you in this this sort of productive mode where you're taking lots of small incremental steps. So I think that was the start of it. And then shortly after, I was confident I could beat like $4 tiers contests. Huge accomplishment, right? I started messing
the most.
I started messing around with microstakes showdown, and then I immediately started to do, I would put out individual entries into like big money showdown. So I'd put like a single $15 entry, almost solely so that I could get access to the CSV, right?
Yep.
So now I'm building up this set of showdown contests and I can test my process. And at some point I got to where I could tell my process was winning, at least over the set of slates I'd looked at on average, and it was winning handily. So I'm like, I ran some numbers and did some bankroll simulations and these sorts of things. And I realized there's a lot of EV to be had, but I wasn't comfortable putting in the investment necessary. You know, I got a family, I can't drop 100K. It was like not acceptable at the time for me on this. So I contacted one of my poker contacts who trust me and I've worked with before. I'm like, here's the deal. I've got this system that works. If you're willing to put up the money, you'll get most of the return, but you're going to take the risk. So if you lose, it's on you. But if we win, I get a cut. And that's kind of what launched my career. In 2019, we basically broke even. And then in do I have that right? 2020, I might be off by a year. 2020, I hit
I think you're right. Just from looking at your results, I believe 2020, it looks like you were crushing everything.
Yeah, one of those shows, it's hard to tell if you're looking at a roto grinder, it's hard to tell with Showdown when you have a first place. Well, in November of 2020, one of those showdowns, they were both Monday night. One of them was a medium-sized tie and I won like $50,000. It was like $1 million for first, but then the next week I split with one other person. So I got $550,000. And so it was a very satisfying message to my backer. I'm like, bad news, I'm ending our staking agreement. Good news, it's because we won a ton of money and I don't need your help anymore. So.
That's great. Yeah, I'm looking at November 9th and November 16th in your Roto-Runners profile. I can see they look identical in your Roto-Runners profile. Right. It just shows first out of 176,470. You get the same number of points, and one of them you split with one other person, one of them you split with several other. That's funny.
Yeah, this is pretty funny.
That's a fun way to start. So actually, I got a listener question about the backer. Somebody said he used to have a backer. Curious what the contract looked like and at what point he went solo. So it sounds like you went solo after winning that big contest for 550,000. Do you any other notes about the contract? Was it?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't mentioned the name. I shouldn't give away too much information in case it doesn't want it to be known. I mean, there's no way to figure out who it was anyway. But yeah, I'll leave the financial details out. But I will say that. So we basically spelled out the kinds of contests I would enter and a sort of min-max volume I expected to play, and what if my past results predicted the future, what I thought our EV was.
Okay.
And then I gave him a range of outcomes too. I'm like, you could lose like 20% of the time we're out 60K or something.
Right.
And then this was like a 96th percentile or 98th percentile outcome. Was hitting that level. I mean, I think that the mean outcome was like plus 50K or something,
which isn't bad.
No, but
Yeah.
I mean,
And you're playing exclusively Showdown, right? NFL Showdown. That was
I
all you
think
were
I
playing
might
at
have
that
been
point.
dabbling a bit of stuff on my own, but yeah, for this staking thing, it was just that sport.
Okay, that's
Just
it.
that
And
one.
were you only entering like the biggest contests? Were you playing both DraftKings and FanDuel, or were you also were you playing like higher stakes as well? What was that looking like?
It was just the huge field DraftKings.
Okay.
That was it. I started looking at a little bit higher stakes, but I think almost all of the volume was between $10 and $33 for each entry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how much regret did you have after you saw how much you would have won if you had entered all of your lineups, before you started playing seriously, when you're just backtesting?
I didn't really.
Okay.
But
Very mature of you.
well, it's not like I'm super zen-like about everything. That didn't bother me. What bothered me was not having a good tax lawyer before I hit that huge payout.
Yeah.
Because I did figure it out, but the combination of DFS and a staker and foreign tax is not one I'd recommend to anyone. That took quite a while to figure out. So I had quite a bit of regret about that. But in terms of not entering bigger contests, I talked about it a little with Jordan, where I dipped my toe into golf after football. I'm like, I've got something good for football. Maybe I can try a different sport. And I'm like, what's the simplest looking sport? And by simple, I mean the projections are as simple as possible.
Doesn't have correlation.
No correlation, huge data sets, widely available, excellent projections to be found. I'm like, I'll give this a go. But when I started golf, I did the same thing I did with football. I just lobbed in like single entries in these huge things to get the CSV.
Okay.
And then once I had enough of a hint that my process was positive, then I started to slowly ramp it up. And then I really ramped it up. And I was very successful in 2020. But after
and that was after you had won $550,000, you still went back to only entering one entry in golf.
Actually, no. I think the golf thing happened before the 550.
Okay. And I suppose you didn't get the full 550 because you were splitting with a backer as well. So I guess
he got most of it as well as he should have. But he after those two experiences, when MLB came around, I'm like, okay, I need to, like, I've done this twice now. I don't want to wait. And I coded up pretty hard for the first few weeks of MLB. And I'm like, I'm just jamming in volume. I'm not going to wait to get the evidence that I'm winning, because I think the likelihood is that, given what I've experienced so far, that this approach is good enough to win. And so I took a more aggressive, like, I'm going to play this until I have evidence that it's not winning, as opposed to waiting till I have evidence that it is winning.
Yep.
And that paid off big time. Again, I had extremely good luck in MLB, but my sims were quite solid across the season. I'm pretty confident in the process that I have there. So.
Yeah, you mentioned on the theory of DFS that, so you don't use Roto Tracker, but you do your own kind of version of Roto Tracker. And you mentioned that you were putting like 1.4% of your MLB lineups into the top 1%, but 1.7% into the top, or sorry, 0.17% into the top 0.1%. Which I have to say, I have very similar results in MLB, and I had a very successful year last year in MLB, and I've been trying to justify it to myself, like, well, maybe that's just how it is in MLB. Like, you don't have the same kind of curve as you have in other sports. Probably we both just got lucky, but it at least made me feel better that you had a comparable percentage in the top 1%, so that maybe there is something to it where it's not, you can't expect the same kind of curve as you have for like NBA or NFL.
I also think it's very hard to estimate your EV accurately with this approach. I totally understand why people do it. It's definitely better than nothing, and I think it's a smart thing to look at. But what I do is I go back. So the reason I don't use Roto Tracker is I have a spreadsheet with every sport and every site and every contest. So absolutely religious about this. So I have how many entries, what's the day, how many games, how many players, how many 150 maxers, what was my result, and then critically after every slate, usually it's what I do in the morning when I first get up because it's just kind of grunt work. I run all my sims again, and I say, okay, run my process basically 100,000 times, and given what everyone else played, take the 150 I actually played out and put in a new set, recompute the payouts, do the same thing 100,000 times, and tell me what my average return was, right?
Okay.
That's why I know I was running. I mean, I didn't need someone to tell me I was running hot at MLB, but I can sort of put a little bit more of a tighter bound on how hot I was running by looking at that number, right?
But
so
you still would have been plus EV. I mean, that was,
yes. If I got the average result, I would have been very happy. Right. So, and the fact that there are so many MLB slates relative to like football or even golf, like there's so many slates.
Yeah.
I'm pretty confident that at least last season my process was plus EV.
Yeah, I'm sure it was just based on. I mean, it's been a couple years now that you've been doing really well.
I only have one season. I have one season of MLB. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it was a very good season.
It was an extreme.
As I recall.
Yeah.
So I want to get into your process a little bit. I have one more listener queue that's sort of related to your background. Mr. Gadget Floor asked, do you use mostly Python for your model? And do you have any tips for getting better at computer programming or Python specifically?
So I'm not a Python programmer, but I've been in the programming business long enough. I'm a relatively seasoned programmer, so I'm at the point where learning a new programming language isn't that big of a deal anymore. It's more understanding how to write good, reliable software that's testable and repeatable, and figuring out how you can fix it and improve it and make it faster. It's these sorts of things. So I don't have any Python specific tips.
Okay.
I would say for getting better at programming, we're in like the golden age of self-directed learning. There are so many good resources on the internet for learning anything computery. I've used them myself, not for this. I did a bunch of courses on machine learning, which were to fill in pieces of my knowledge that I wanted to have that I didn't have. I mean, barely, it cost like a few $100s to get like amazing material from like world-renowned people. So if it's really, you can find great stuff if you're just willing to put in the time. You can get pretty far. I would say for programming specifically, just start small and slowly build your way up. Like, it's really useful to be able to write small little programs to make your life easier. So like, think of the smallest problem you can think of that you want to solve for yourself and maybe try that. It could be something as simple as like, I have this CSV of all my lineups and I want to write a script that tells me what percentage of each player I have. Now you can do this in Excel, but like that would be an example for like a beginner, just to get familiarization with whatever language you're using. So.
And just build up from there. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's good advice. Let me take a break from this conversation with Daniel to tell you about our sponsor, NOS Advantage. NOS Advantage is bringing you a different way to enjoy DFS with player props contests. It's 100% peer-to-peer to help level the playing field. NOS Advantage offers 500 player props, and all new users get a $25 deposit bonus with promo code Awesemo. That's AWESEMO. NOS Advantage has mass entry capability and big prize pools. Beat your friends, not the house. Use our NOS Advantage projections and optimal lineup tool to help you take down big prizes. Download it in the App Store or play on nosadvantage.com. Now let's get into your process a little bit. So I'm going to start with a quote of yours from the theory of DFS about talking about process. You said, I'm sort of torn about how much to reveal about my process. I've talked more and more about it after I realized that it's really hard to do all of the things I've done. It took me a long time to get something I was happy with. And if you're good enough to do that, you probably don't need my help anyway, which was kind of my assumption about people like you. So after listening to your interview, you know, a lot of people were talking about your interview with Blender, and talking about, you know, how much you talked about, and some of us, like myself, had the reaction, well, I can't do what he's doing anyway. Like most people are not going to be able to replicate what you do. And whereas others, I think Brick is, you know, he is a little bit, plays it closer to the chest because he's worried about, in his terms, creating a monster. So I think creating somebody like yourself, giving away just a little bit too much, and you know,
Yeah.
then having somebody else emerge on the high stakes scene, I think in particular is what he's nervous about. But obviously there's parts of your process that you're not going to want to share, but is your general philosophy still that you're comfortable talking about your process because it would be difficult to replicate anyway?
Well, I've taken, so I listened to all your podcasts, and I heard your interview with Brick, and I listened to Lawl's, and so I take what he's saying to heart, and I don't pretend I have like this dialed in exactly right. But I mean, the good news is I can always just hit the undo button, right? And then everybody, no, I mean,
Right.
I think it's kind of ironic because he's like, he doesn't want to create a monster, and then he tried to recreate something I did, and now it's changed. So
Right.
the monster I might have created
Yeah.
is him. But I think it's a mix. I mean, so I have had people ask me questions on Twitter and various discords, and I'll help people up to a point. But there's a point where, like, if you're asking me certain kinds of questions, it's like you're on your own, bro. You
Yeah.
know, it's like I
Is
had
it if you're asking smart questions? Is that where you?
It's more, it's not even a level of it's which level, what level you're at.
Okay.
So like I'll be happy to like, and I've done this before. I've used my software to like try and figure out. Someone's like, you know, how owned should this guy be? I'm like, well, and if it's a Tuesday morning and I'm bored and I'm procrastinating, I'll like, oh, I'll run a sim. Let's see what it says, and we'll, you know, sort of interact with that data at a human level and try to reason about it. Like, you know, is the software full of shit, or is there something real going on here, or does it matter? But I've had people say, you know, are you using like, how many layers are you using in this neural net? I'm like, or like which algorithms are you using? I'm like, dude, I'm polite about it. I'm like, sorry, I'm not comfortable asking it,
Right.
answering it. But I'll tell you a funny story. Somebody was contacted with me about MLB. He was trying to do something for MLB and software, and he said, you know, I'm trying to do something automated in MLB, and the hardest part of them, the most difficulty I'm having is in lineup generation, because there's so many combos and weird things. And I'm like, do you have any advice? And I was like, I'm not comfortable. I was like, I agree, that's the hardest part for this sport. And I said, I'm not comfortable sharing that, but I'll tell you, I have some code. The current code I have for MLB, just the lineup part, we'll talk about my process in a minute, but it's called fifth try lineup generator.
This is what you've named it.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
I tried a bunch of things, and they all had various and sundry problems, and I mean,
yep.
Yeah. So it took me a lot of time to get there, and I don't think I'm willing to give up all of that effort it took to trial and error and testing, and
yep.
It's a lot of work, and I'm not at the point where I'm going to give that kind of stuff away. Yeah.
Which try were you using last year?
That was fifth try.
Oh,
well,
okay.
At the very beginning, so I launched into MLB kind of heedless, like a wild man, and over the first few weeks, I kept improving the lineup generation until I got it where I wanted. So
okay, so you're willing to talk about it generally. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about programming because I wouldn't know how to anyway, so you don't have to worry about that from me. But let's talk about it a little bit. So I'll start with just the general questions, and we can just kind of yes no these in the beginning to some extent, and then we can get into a little bit more. But I think you've kind of covered this. Yes, you do your own simulations. I don't think I need to necessarily, unless you have something else you want to say about doing your own simulations.
No, but
Okay.
I will say there's two elements to simulations.
Okay.
There's simulate. Most people, when they talk about in the DFS space, they're talking about simulating athlete performance, basically
Yep.
simulating the fantasy points.
Play by play.
Yeah. Well, it could be. It doesn't have to be. You're just using some process. You can think of it like a box. You push a button, and it says, "Here are all the scores for the players." Push the button again.
Okay.
Different set of scores comes out. You keep pushing that button, and hopefully, the scores will have the properties that you expect in terms of the variance of each player and any correlation that there is between the players, right? So if you want to get super geeky about it, the whole thing with projections and simulations, it's one thing, and what you have is it's a joint probability distribution across all of the athlete fantasy performance. That would be a mathematical description, right?
Yeah.
But mechanistically, I'm more of a computer guy. I think of it as this, you turn crank, spit out numbers. Turn crank, different numbers come out. And you turn that crank a lot of times, like a lot of times. Right? So yeah, but this second, that's the first kind of simulation. That's mostly what people are talking about. The second is to try and simulate the players in the contest.
Yep.
What are their strategic choices?
So the actual lineup entries in a DFS contest.
Right. What would a smart person do?
Yep.
And that's also part of my process. And I don't know how many other people are doing that piece.
And are you, to the extent you're willing to share, so is your software looking at, like, historically what Whistles Go Woo has done and what Awesemo has done? Is it looking at the kind of lineups that specific users have generated in the past that they expect to, that you expect to enter into the contest, and making smart decisions based on what specific users are doing?
No, so I'm gonna really geek out here, so look out. Yeah, so there's two kinds of two classes of machine learning. What you're describing is called supervised learning, and it's the same kind of thing that you see when you have, you upload a photo to an app and it recognizes that it's your wife or it's a cat. Okay. And it's called supervised because the way those things are generated, and it's almost always neural networks of various configurations. I won't bore you with the details here. You have a huge data set, right?
Yep.
Millions, tens of millions of photos that are already labeled. This is a cat. This is Neil's wife. This is a fire truck, right? You feed that into something mystical and magical, and it churns, and it learns how to recognize things. It's called supervised learning because it's being given the questions and the answers in its learning process. Okay. So I have, as of yet, have not tried to do things that way. I wouldn't be surprised if people were doing it because it's a really interesting avenue. Mm-hmm. But I'm doing unsupervised learning where my code tries to discover the strategies entirely by playing itself, basically. Okay. So it's a battle to the death against itself, and gradually gets better and better, hopefully, if my software is doing. Now, how I do that, it's a lot of customs. There's a lot of research papers and a lot of custom crap in there. It's a big mess, but that's sort of how, very high level, what I try to do. Okay.
Yeah, that's so here's what you said on the theory of you. So I was going to ask you about this as well, because this is all very it sounds very interesting. It's also a little bit above my head, and maybe you're kind of helping me a little bit to understand, but I'll read what you said on the theory of DFS and see if you can expound even more. So you said, the process I use has all these intelligent agents trying to exploit each other until they can't exploit each other anymore. Because of that, the software considers all of the lineups to have the same EV. They're all equally good. You said it keeps crunching and crunching and crunching until it can't tell the difference in EV between any of the lineups anymore. So I was going to ask you how to expound on this because, like I said, it's a little bit over my head. Are you saying that the software didn't know which lineups are plus EV going in? Like it doesn't know until it runs the sims, but then it figures it out by pitting the lineups against each other? Is that's kind of what you just said? Am I understanding that right? That it doesn't know going in, but then it figures out which ones are plus EV by pitting them against each other?
you're most of the way there.
Okay.
80% of the way there. The only thing that's slightly off, and it's very confusing if you're not used to thinking this way, is it's not identifying plus EV lineups.
Okay.
It's identifying a set of lineups that if everyone is playing super smart and everybody plays with the right frequency, then it doesn't matter which of these you play, because you can't get an edge. Like lineup A, but it's easier to think about it in something like Showdown or MMA, where there's a very small set of lineups and dupes are a thing. So you imagine a winner-take-all contest, which is actually not that far from some of these MMA contests in terms of how the payout structures are.
Yeah.
So imagine that there's, it's a $1 contest and it's 100,000 the first. Okay. And let's say there's a million possible lineups or whatever. So roughly speaking, you would expect each lineup to be duplicated. And the more likely it is to win, the more duplicated it is.
Yep.
Okay? So if everyone's playing perfectly, the odds of a lineup being duped are going to be exactly proportional to how likely it is to win. So if lineup A has a 1 in 100 chance to win, there's 100,000 entries, you expect it to be duped exactly 1,000 times on average, if everyone is playing perfectly.
Yep.
But if it's a 1 in 100,000 to win, you would expect to see it once.
Yep. Okay.
But if everybody plays with those frequencies, it doesn't matter which one you pick. If everyone else has the optimal frequency,
right,
it's just a question of variance at that point. If you can pick the 1 in 100, you're much more likely to get a payout, but it's going to be chopped 100 ways.
Right.
Right. You could pick the 1 in 100,000, very rarely going to win, but you're going to have a huge payday. But if you do the math, the average payout is exactly the same. They're all going to be break even before the rake. If you assume there's no rake, then all of these entries are break even, right? It's just they're played with different frequencies because some are more likely than others, right, to win.
Right.
Now, this all starts to get really messy as soon as you get to real contests, where you can't even realistically model all of the lineups because there are trillions upon trillions of them, and they're all correlated in weird ways, and the payout is not winner take all, and there's all sorts of mess there.
But so MMA seems to be a great place to kind of test this, right? To test this kind of model, because there's a limited number of lineups you can generate.
Yeah. So if we're talking about my process as a whole, I could just take a step back and do very high level. So I think I talk about this to Jordan too, but I've got 3 phases. The first is lineup generation, which is just generate a bunch of reasonable looking lineups. I haven't done any sims or anything, just somehow, and this is actually can be quite tricky in some sports. But in a sport like MMA, there's not that many lineups. For a computer, it's usually a couple 100,000. It's nothing. You could fit it in a spreadsheet. Okay, and then the second thing is that joint probability distribution, right? You need to pull that crank and simulate a whole bunch of outcomes. And then the third part is you take those first 2 pieces and figure out how often lineups should be played, right? That is extremely technical and hard. It's what I've spent a lot of my time focused on. So I suspect it's where a lot of my edge probably comes from, although it's hard to know for sure. There's a lot of moving parts to this, as you can tell, but top level at a high level, that's it. It's lineups, and then sims, and then lots of computation to figure out what to do with all of that. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are you basing that on? So how do you end up choosing your lineups essentially? So you're creating all of these hundreds of thousands of lineups, and they're competing against each other, and that's based on projections. Is it based on projections alone, like how they or like range of outcomes for individual players and lineups? Is that how you determine how frequently one lineup beats another lineup? Is it just like anything else essentially?
It's all simulated out, right?
Okay.
So it's basically a contest between all of these lineups, and there's technical details that I don't want to go into, and
Okay.
also would probably be super boring, frankly. But yeah, it's basically these lineups are competing against each other in a
Okay.
sense.
Okay, and I assume my assumption has been that you need to have some sort of an ownership projection for it to make any sense for it to do these. Are you not factoring in? You're not doing any kind of ownership computation. That's something that your simulator is doing for you.
Yeah, so well, there's two senses in which we can talk about ownership. There's what we think people will do, which is what sites like Awesemo and Roto Grinders and others do, which is a hard problem. I not envy the people doing that. There's a legitimately, but then there's what the ownership would be if everybody played extremely high level.
Yep.
I get the second thing through my process.
Okay.
I don't pay any attention to the first thing, but that's just now. I mean, this goes right to what the difference between exploitative style and balanced style is. I reserve the right to become exploitive at any time. I think there's a lot of money to be made there, and I suspect many DFS pros, most of their edge comes from exploiting mistakes of the field.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of it. And I'm not getting all of that EV, right? Because
so this is a big discussion that I wanted to have. The exploitative, you describe yourself as having a balanced style of play, but could it also be described as being game theory optimal?
Those are the same thing. I think the term game theory optimal is really unfortunate, so I try not to use it myself. The word optimal is very, that's the unfortunate part of the phrase. I can't remember if it was Math of Poker, if it was those guys who brought that. Those are smart guys.
Okay.
I can't remember who coined the term, because the word optimal implies best, but that's not what's meant in this sense.
Which I think is why I had assumed that exploitative was why I assumed that game theory optimal and exploitative was the same thing, because I think of game theory optimal being the best decision that you can make game theory wise. So I had assumed that would be exploitative, and then of course it sounds to me like so you've described your process, you describe it as balanced, but you know, Brick75 said on our show that after hearing your interview with Blender, he switched up his style of play to be more like yours. So he's trying to be a little bit more game theory optimal or balanced rather than exploitative, which is the way that I play and the way Blender plays, and I think the way a lot of pros play is in exploitative style. But what do you think are the advantages of playing game theory optimal rather than exploitative? You just said that you might switch it up, so you're not going to necessarily be game theory optimal forever. You haven't decided yet the way that you want to play going forward, but you've been very successful playing a balanced style of play. So do you think that there are advantages to just playing the balanced style of play rather than playing an exploitative style of play? And I'll add in a listener question since we're on the topic. Eric Most asked, do you think you're giving up edge by playing a game theory optimal strategy instead of exploitable?
So I'll start with the second question. So the answer to the second question is yes, by definition, in the technical sense, right? So if you play with toy games, you can show very clearly, and actually Blender did this on one of his morning shows, which was pretty cool. He did it in Excel, which was like, I would never think to do it in Excel, but he basically created a spreadsheet where he showed a very simple fictional contest with payout probabilities. And he showed that if you change the field's percentages, but you keep playing the optimal, and this is all assuming rake free, of course, you win money. But if you dial up the deltas, basically, that is, if somebody is over on player A, you go to 0, would be optimal, all things being equal. And if they're under, you cram it in, right? That would be like maximally exploitative. Then the EV goes up, and it goes up a lot. So in theory, in a theoretical game, the difference between the EV of an exploitative style versus a balanced style, where your opponents are making major mistakes, can be quite large. Okay, if you play around with it.
Yep.
So yes, I am definitely giving something up there. But the thing is, in order to exploit, you need two things. First of all, in order to exploit the field, to exploit a mistake, you need to first know that it's a mistake. So you have to have some sense of what the correct ownership is, right? When we say a player is overowned, what does that mean? It means we have some prior that the ownership should be X and the field is doing 1.3X, right? So you need to know what the correct ownership should be, which I try to figure that out as best I can. But then you also need to know what the field is actually going to do. So you have to be making predictions, right?
Yep.
And then the third thing is you have to figure out how to combine those two things together intelligently to make good entries. Because in the simple games, it's quite easy. You just, full fade the things that they're over and jam in the ones they're under. Yep. But as you know, lineups are not that simple. There's lots of interlocking pieces and correlations. So it's harder. The advantage to my approach is it's easier to execute, right? Once I'm comfortable that my sims and my lineup generation and my voodoo magic piece are all working, I don't really have to do anything. If you're exploiting, you're constantly, every slate is different and you have to constantly recompute, for yourself, what am I doing to get different? What are the field mistakes? But the disadvantage to exploitative play is quite clear too. One, you're necessarily predicting other people's mistakes, which is hard, and you're going to get it wrong. And when you get it wrong, you're really going to get punished, right? If you think the field is way under on a guy and you cram it in, and then it turns out that they were slightly over, you are just bleeding.
Happens to me all the time.
Of course, yeah. It's really hard. So it's gonna ramp up your volatility. And you can see that in a toy game too. You could play with this in Excel like Jordan did and just run your own like micro sim basically. And you'll see that the EV goes way up with the volatility. Right?
Yep.
And I don't know about you, but I have plenty of volatility as it is.
Right.
In my DFS.
Yep.
So I do have some ideas about how to create something that exploits the field automatically and tries to predict mistakes. I'm kicking around some ideas there.
It's not something you're using yet. It's something that you might add to your process. So you'll just kind of keep your foot on our necks in MLB. You're just gonna.
I don't know. I mean, it could be hard. I mean, the tricky part is also you need to be able to, and I think Bricks talked about this. You want to back test your takes.
Yeah.
So I would spend quite a bit of effort into basically, if I were to take a stand because of ownership, I would have to bake that into a testable process. So I'd have to have it like be some kind of configuration file. I'm like, I'm taking a stand. I think this guy is going to have this much ownership and that's too much. And I'm going to play him half as often as this output. And I have to save that so that I can keep myself honest, right?
Yep.
Otherwise, I don't know if I'm doing it right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that was part of the reason that you didn't want to do classic NBA style for like the full slates, was because it is harder to backtest. Have you found a way to better backtest your NBA lineups?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
And I don't think I ever will. I'm just trying to get comfortable with that kind of uncertainty, and just live with it. I just have to trust that, like, at least for the low mid stakes, that your $10, $20 entry, like, surely what I'm doing is better than the field, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but I mean, the thing is though, the rake is just a tremendous negative downforce or a headwind. I think it's one thing that isn't talked about enough. It's just such a huge obstacle to overcome. So
Yeah.
I still have mixed feelings about NBA Classic for me. Just the uncertainty of my process, and also just the time commitment. I'll probably continue doing what I'm doing. I'm still cramming in a fair bit of showdown volume, even though I'm not sure I'm winning there. It's probably very close to break even, one side or the other. I think my lifetime sim results for it are like 0.6% ROI.
For NBA.
For NBA Showdown, yeah. And I can't imagine, I did make some NBA changes, and I started using more projection sources to try and see if that helped. I haven't seen a lot of signal. I think all of the reputable projection teams do really good work from what I can tell. I've back tested a bunch of different sites, and it's like, well, on any given slate, it's like, oh, this week, this slate Awesemo just crushed. And then the next slate, it's like, oh, RG just killed everyone. And then it's ETR or whoever. But I'm interested in the average across time. And it's still a limited sample, but I don't have clear signal there that any one source or any mixture of sources is significantly better than others, enough to move the needle, at least. I'm sure somebody is the best. It would probably take quite a long time to tell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that how you generally do projections? You take them from multiple different sources, you combine them, do the aggregation style?
It depends on the sport. I just started doing that more. I resisted doing that just because I was lazy and I didn't want to deal with all of the different names of players and aliases and all of it, just the janitorial work, as it were. But I'm like, I have to do this. And I've done it for some sports, enough for others. And you need good projection quality, but after a certain point, it's not the driver anymore. Like, it's a necessary but not sufficient for success.
Okay, makes sense.
That's my take anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so now that I know that you're playing NBA Classic, I need to ask about that a little bit, about your process a little bit, like how you work in late swap optimizers. So I know Brick75, who I think of as being similar to you, sort of in your process, in that you both do your own simulations. I think not many people do that, so I think that you're a little bit similar. And he ultimately said that he does simulations, and for a lot of other sports, he will just run simulations if there is no late swap. But for NBA, he ends up having to use an optimizer. He uses Fantasy Cruncher. So I'm curious, do you use any kind of optimizer for NBA, or have you found a way to still use your program and do it within a simulator?
So for reasons that are either admirable or just arrogant and stubborn, depending on my mood, I'm just constitutionally incapable of using other people's tools if it's something I think I can write myself. And there's good and bad parts to that. I probably waste some time, but I do learn stuff, and I do get to like develop just what I need and nothing more, which has an advantage. So my late swap process does involve simulations coupled with an optimizer that I wrote.
Okay.
I've only deployed it for DraftKings so far. So for FanDuel, I just use the RG late swap tool, but I'll eventually use. It's the same damn thing. And I basically wrote the simplest thing I could live with, that I thought wasn't terrible. And it feels a little bit like I'm kind of faking my way through it. So there's things I can configure, but I'm having to make sort of arbitrary judgment calls about like things like, how much do I weight the median? And like, I look at projections, but I also sim results and I mix them up, and so I try to do some. I try to do
more advanced than the rest of us.
Yeah, but a lot of it is like, I'm like, okay. I mean, this is the closest to actually playing DFS like a normal person that I come, is the late swap, because I'm like, okay, there's a change in this lineup. I have 10 lineups with this guy out of 150, and he's not really viable anymore. But he didn't open up huge value on his team either. So I might say, I'm just going to late swap those 10 lineups because it doesn't really affect my strategy elsewhere.
Okay.
But another slate will be like, this guy's out. I have a ton of them. There's huge value that just opened up. It's like my whole world has just been flipped upside down, and along with anyone else who's paying attention, right? So this is why I can't backtest any of that. It's like I'd have to simulate myself making these decisions. I can't really do that.
So I think what I fear the most is, and I'm glad to hear that you're not there yet, is somebody who's going to do simulations with late swap that factor in what everybody else is doing, and like the ownership that's already, the lineups that already exist in the contest, and do simulations that make the best lineups optimally for the lineups that you can see in there. Is that something that you think I need to worry about? Is that something that you think anybody's going to figure out in the next 5-10 years? And that's not my idea. I've heard other people talk about this concept as well. Do you think it's a real fear?
I can cue up my best evil laugh. It's something I've definitely considered doing. I think it's a genuinely hard problem. Yeah, there are a few contest types and formats where it's very appealing to me, where I might try to attack it.
Like NFL, I suppose, would be one of the easiest because it's just like 2 main start times.
I could tell you, but then I'd have to.
We're in completely different states. You can can't take me out from there. I don't. Maybe you could. I don't know what you're capable of. You probably have drones.
Yeah.
I'll stop asking questions.
No, just
okay.
No, I haven't done it yet, but there are a couple of there's a couple spots where I think I know exactly what I would want to do.
Okay. Interesting.
And it's to the point where it wouldn't surprise me if somebody is already doing it.
Okay. Oh, well, that's I don't like to hear that. So you think we are close?
I don't think it's the kind of contest you and I mostly play.
Okay.
Good
to hear.
I'm just it's conjecture.
Okay.
It's just
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Good to know. Let's talk a little bit. So we've talked most of my main process questions. I think we've covered sort of out of order because it was I didn't really know the order to ask them in because it's such a complex problem for me. Talking about your process was a little bit
barely
advanced. Yeah, right. So, but let's move on to contest and sports selection a little bit, because you said some interesting things in on your show with Blender. You said for NBA Showdown, first of all, you said for NBA Showdown, I'm not convinced my method can win. You also said I'm not convinced I have much of an edge at all in golf. Two different times during the show. So I'm curious, are there any sports that you've back tested and decided to stop playing because there wasn't enough EV?
Okay, so I feel stronger, more. First of all, I'm not 100% confident in any of this, but I'm more confident that my NBA approach is very close to the break-even line, and I'm not sure which side it's on.
Okay.
Golf, and the reason for that is I've entered is twofold. The number of NBA Showdown contests I've entered is quite large. I've entered a ton of them, the big ones, the small ones. And there's some nuance there where, as you would expect, as the contests get larger in terms of number of entrants, the edge gets larger as well, because there are only so many competitive lineups and competitive players out there. So, the larger the number of competitors, the smaller a percentage it becomes. But, and it's hard to tell because I've made some changes, and I can't backtest all of them for reasons I won't go into.
Okay.
But yeah, I've been toying around with higher stakes Showdown and very small field, like the $300 14-man I've been playing around with a lot, and 11-man type stuff.
Okay.
And I have some ideas there about the kinds of mistakes people are making. And I do think, again, I will say, even at that level, I do think my approach is beating the field. I just not convinced it's beating the field and the rake.
Yep.
Golf is really weird. So golf, I had a ton of success in 2020, both in simulated results and in actual results. In 2021, I had excellent real results and slightly negative simulated results. So I was just benefiting from variance. My process was not winning. But now, come again in 2022, it's looking like 2020.
Oh, nice.
The first quarter of this year, excellent real results, excellent simulator results. I just don't know what to make of it. Part of it is you only get one real slate a week. I mean, you get the showdowns too, but they're somewhat correlated with each other. So it's not like you're getting a full set of separate slates because people tend to do similar things. So I don't know if it's just variance. I did improve part of my process. One of those three main things, I did make improvements in one of them, and it could be that helped.
Okay.
But I just don't know. It's so hard to tell. It's extremely humbling. I think you know this, and anybody who plays a lot of volume knows this. It's just so hard to tell how well your process is performing, even using the stuff I use, which gives me a lot more information than most people have.
Yeah.
Like most people, you just have your results to go on, and like, how often did I make it to the top 1%? Right. But even simulating, like, let's run my process 100,000 times and see how it did. I still have a lot of uncertainty. And the thing is, the smaller your edges, the larger the uncertainty is going to be, because I'm highly confident that my process is plus EV for MLB because the edge I have measured enough is large enough, and the number of slates is large enough that even if it's twice as good on paper as it is in real life, it's still significant enough that I know there's an edge.
Right.
Showdown, same thing. Showdown NFL. There's just so much dead money that even my process, I've been running like God in my on the process level. I'm still plus EV there.
Right? When you say dead money in NFL Showdown, are you referring generally to lineups that are too chalky, like the lineups that are duplicated 500 times?
Yeah.
Or lineups that just don't project well enough? Or what do you mean by dead money in general?
I think of it in terms of the field, the behavior of the field as a whole, because there's multiple mistakes you see all the time. Ironically, my software makes one of them because of the way my process works, but it doesn't matter all that much. So one of them is what you just talked about. Like, you have a lineup that's duped, 2,000 times. We've actually seen over 2,000 dupes win. And now when I say my software makes the same mistake, I'm saying that from an exploitative standpoint, where you could look at this lineup and say, okay, in a balanced approach, it should be duped 300 times. Let's say that's the right number. And it's actually duped 2,200 times, right? So it's minus EV. Well, you could say from an exploitative standpoint, look, it's the number 4 optimal on Awesemo. Like, you should just never play one that close to the top.
Right.
It's gonna be like 8 billion dupes. Just don't play that. And yeah, that's correct, right? So but the thing is, so I've thought about trying to incorporate those kind of small tweaks. But I'm playing so many lineups that it doesn't matter all that much. Like, the amount of EV I gain, and it would be a bunch of work. Like, I'd have to create a special process for each site and pull out different optos and make sure that, there's only a few clusters. I mean, I just haven't bothered with it. But if you're an actual human playing, yeah, don't play those. Like, why would you play those?
Well, you do a pretty good job in general of not duping anyway. I mean, your software, for the most part, is doing a really good job of weeding out those kind of lineups.
Well, it still plays them. It's just less likely to play them in the field.
Right. Yeah.
So
Okay.
I still do play. I've been up there with all of the chalk donkeys splitting 800 ways. Like you'll find those
Yeah.
in my results. It just, all things considered, I'm less likely to be up there.
Right.
If you assume my process is actually working the way I intend it to work, right?
Okay. Yep.
And
That
I
makes
do
sense.
see that. I actually wrote a tool to do, I won't get into why, this is for another podcast, but I wrote a tool that basically humanizes the output of my software. So I basically run my process, and then it generates a spreadsheet, and it lists each lineup, and then its projection, and then how often my software thought it should be duped, and then how often it was duped.
Okay.
And so it's exactly what you would expect. All of the lineups at the top, I expect there to be X dupes, and then there's some 1 point or 2 point or occasionally 20.7X of that number for the ones at the top.
Yep.
All the over ownership is at the top, and then you can see it popping in weird places in the spreadsheet, and then if you look, those are just different sites optimums.
Oh, funny.
Yeah, so you see these huge spikes in the middle of the spreadsheet, right? And then oftentimes the stuff in the middle and at the bottom is underowned, right? Because that ownership had to go somewhere, right? So, yeah, but it's encouraging to see that, and I think that kind of analysis gives me comfort that I'm, if you assume my sims are good, and I'm not convinced they are for every sport. I can get into that too. If you think my sims are good, then that's exactly what I want to see. Like if I get to the point where those numbers like across the board are sort of on par with each other, like then my approach can't win. And I would say no approach can win at that point.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. For NFL Showdown in particular, the one thing I remember about looking at your lineups is at one point you had a lineup that was used like full salary or close to it. So usually one of the ways that I get unique in NFL Showdown is leaving salary on the table. And I looked at yours in particular, and you had one that was like, it was totally used almost the entire salary cap, had 0 dupes, and it was because you played Equanimous St. Brown, who is a player that I remember, and I was like, man, he like, I don't think he's played the past 2 or 3 weeks, but then I think he actually got a couple targets that game. So it's like, man, this whatever he's doing is really smart, because he figured out this player that hasn't played, and now he's randomly popped into a lineup and got a target or 2.
Well, I mean, so that can either mean I've done something really smart or done something really stupid, right?
Sure, sure.
This is the problem when looking at computer outputs. If it does something novel, it's either good news or bad news, right? It's like, oh, nobody is doing this thing. Maybe it's a genius, or maybe I'm a moron.
Right.
And my default assumption is going to be the second one until proven otherwise, right? So I think with Showdown in particular, it's very hard. So I mentioned earlier that I'm not sure my sims are good for all sports, and NFL Showdown is funny because if you ask me what sport do I have the most edge in, it's NFL Showdown, and it's not very close.
I was going to ask you that.
I'm sorry, short answer. If you ask me which sport do you have the worst process in, it's also NFL Showdown.
Interesting.
Because simulating football well is hard, because all sorts of shit can happen. It's the one sport I actually watch. My wife and kid are more into it than I am, I think, but we go to Broncos games a couple times a year. I enjoy it, although I didn't enjoy it so much last season. I don't know. Last season was not fun to watch for me. But
for most people, I think.
Yeah, I don't know.
It wasn't a great season.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, the number of things that can happen is so vast, and we have such small sample sizes to deal with. So that's already makes it very hard to accurately simulate the games. And you compound that with Showdown, where the number of possible lineups is so small and the prize pools are so huge that estimating the likelihood of really outlier events becomes really, really important. So your Equinimia St. Brown example, like there's an example of an outlier player where it could be, I'm making up some numbers here, like it could be if there's like a 98% chance he gets a 0, he's unplayable. But if it's a 95% chance, then all of a sudden he's playable.
Mm-hmm.
Like these subtle differences in outlier events could be the difference between winning first, right? That the famous slate where the backup quarterback won. Who was that?
Mariota.
Mariota, right. I mean, I couldn't even be mad. I was like, that's just freaking awesome. Like, you got that's so great. I mean, so estimating those extremely low probability events is really hard to do. I don't think I'm particularly good at it. I'm sure other people are doing way better simulation methodologies than I use. And still, I would say of all the sports, that's the one I have the biggest edge, just because there's so many massively overduped lineups.
So that's what you're talking about when you were saying that you think some of your simulations are bad. You were talking about NFL Showdown, which also happens to be a sport that you crush, or a contest type that you crush. That's funny. Any other sports that you think that your simulations are bad in?
That one is the worst. I think the next worst would be NBA. And the reason for I say that is it's not so much so my simulations in NBA are powered by projections, Awesemo among them. And the problem with NBA is because it's the most projectable sport in terms of the distribution of outcomes is the most normal of any sport, and they're the most predictable, there's still a lot of variance. So because of that, it's sort of a paradox. Having knowledge about the NBA above and beyond the field is a big edge.
Yeah.
The subtleties of, so each NBA scenario is different. It's almost like each slate or even each game, it's like a completely new sport has been invented because we're seeing completely new rotation, or we don't know what the rotation is, different people playing against different other people. Maybe the coach is trying out something completely new.
Yep.
So this is why someone like Travis Petty can be so competitive, and because that knowledge is so valuable. And I think I don't want to be Travis. Like I don't want to do what it takes to
it's a lot of work.
Get that. Yeah. I think if you love the game and you have his mind for it, I get it.
Yeah.
But I can enjoy basketball, but there's no way I could get into it to that level. So I know for a fact that I'll never be elite at NBA because what it takes to get there is not something I'm willing to do. Right.
Right.
And as amazing as projection teams at like Awesemo and RotoGrinders are, there's only so much you can cram in to a median projection.
Right.
Or a median with a ceiling and a floor. Like there's all sorts of subtleties. Like you have some bench player who's either going to play 20 minutes or he's going to play 8 minutes.
Right. And we just saw that with Dwight Howard a couple weeks ago, where we all played him. He was like 50% owned, maybe not, maybe it was 35% or something like that. And he played 5 minutes, and it was just, it's so unpredictable with the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, ideally what you want to do is model all of that in your sim. You say, well, 20% of the time it's going to look like this, and 50% of the time do this, and 30% do this, right?
Yeah.
This is
and then if Dwight Howard isn't playing, then who is playing? Exactly.
And that's really hard. I mean, that's the kind of thing I imagine someone like Travis is kind of doing in his head, right?
Right.
And he can look at projection sources and say, this projection right here, there's other information behind this projection, and people are going to get it wrong. because I think this guy has a 30% chance to just crush for his salary, and nobody's going to see it because they don't understand that the last 5 times the coach was in this spot, he did this weird thing, and it could be that kind of thing again, right?
Right.
And I mean, I've never talked to Travis, but it's my take listening to him is that like that's where all of his edge is coming. And I'm not saying that to knock him like he's like an idiot. I'm sure he understands like optimizers and game theory, better than most of the field, but that's not why he's winning, right?
Yeah,
he's
his
crushing
projections seem to be.
Yeah.
I talked about this with Brick. If you combine, Brick and what Brick is doing with what Petty is doing, and the same thing with you. If you combine what you're doing with what Petty is doing, you'll absolutely crush NBA. And I mean, Petty, as Brick said, Petty doesn't need us. He's crushing NBA anyway, which is true. So maybe it doesn't. I mean, maybe that's all it takes. He's just so good at doing the rotations. You bring me back. I actually missed a listener question that I was going to ask you earlier as we're talking about this, that I think is relevant to this discussion of how one player playing less means another player is playing more and might be part of an answer. So somebody asked, J187 on Discord asked, what particular advantage do you see Sims having over optimizers like Fantasy Cruncher?
Okay. So you're just doing things at a different level. I think a lot of people hear simulations and their eyes kind of start circling and they think of this magical thing.
Yep. So you've seen me on these shows before.
No, I usually do on the treadmill with my iPhone, but all a simulation is trying to roll out a game outcome. But I think Brick mentioned this maybe on your podcast or maybe another. If you're in something like Fantasy Cruncher or RG or whatever, and you generate lineups and you're adding randomness.
Yeah, you said
that is a simulation.
Yep.
It's a very localized one.
Yep.
But you are simulating athlete performance. Right. And the first, I've never used Fantasy Cruncher, but I can understand how this would work. Each lineup, you generate all of the fantasy points for all of the NBA players. First, you shake on some randomness, and then you solve, and then you go to the next one. Yep. Right? Yep. That is a simulation. The difference is more a simulation first approach, which is what I do. So if you want to evaluate how lineups do against each other, I don't see another way to do that. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a very successful process like you do using Fantasy Cruncher. Whatever, there's different ways to get there. Whatever I gain in my methodology, you might be gaining and more by understanding field mistakes and punishing them, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to get there.
Okay. Let's move on to a few listener questions because we got several, and I've already asked a few of them, but I thought some of these are interesting. Alex K14 asked, when pricing is reasonable across the slate, how do you decide on your max exposures for your highest players out of 150 set? Is it a fixed pyramid of exposures when pricing is reasonable?
Yeah, I don't do anything like that at all.
Okay.
So I understand the question and where it's coming from, but that's coming from a normal person who uses tools and generates lineups.
You're doing something like what I do.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not a good person to ask those questions because I almost never create lineups like.
Do you look at your player exposures when you're choosing your 150 set? So you talked about this a little bit. So you're narrowing down your number of lineups. And I think you said on the podcast with Blender that it doesn't really matter which lineups you choose. So are you looking at different player exposures and trying to, making decisions based on wanting to diversify your lineup set, or how do you choose?
I kind of get that for free, and I actually don't choose. I randomize. So
okay.
Roughly speaking, if my process thinks player A should be played at 5%, then on average, 5% of my lineups will have him.
Right.
Now, it's not never going to be exactly 5% because it's kind of randomized. But if you ran my process a million times,
That's
what it would be on average in my 150 set.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. So you're not making any kind of exposure decisions. You're randomizing it, and whatever you get, you get. And over time, you're going to have the GTO, lineup sets that you should have, the percentage that you should have. But day to day, you might not have exactly the percentage that your simulations would tell you should have.
Right.
Just
And
over time, you're going to.
That's right. I do output all that stuff for like debugging and just for curiosity. I'm like, oh, I've got 23% of this guy today, and see what happens with that. You notice it, the randomness matters the most for the lowest probability events, of course. So if I have a MLB pitcher and my process says he should be owned 38%, it's going to be relatively close to that number. But if I have some outlier guy that should be in 2% of lineups, well, that's in 150 set, that's 3 lineups.
Right.
I could have 0. I could have 3. I could have 6. It could be, relatively speaking, a wide divergence. But yeah, over time, it should be about the average.
Okay. JBC69, who's also one of the top players in the world, asks, maybe music is something that you have in common with top players. He asks, what song should my wife play me on violin while I build in order to maximize DFS returns?
Well, I don't know how good of a player she is, but if she has a classical background, I might go for like a Bach unaccompanied suite, maybe something up tempo like a jig or prelude. Maybe.
Depends on the sport, maybe.
Yeah, yes, that's good. I mean,
MMA, you really want something that's kind of intense. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that some more, but yeah, unaccompanied.
You can get back to him on Twitter if you want to.
Yeah, all right. I'll mull that over a little bit more.
Josh Sandoval asks a different question. So on a previous podcast with Blender, you asked, you shared that you had done some testing you had looked at PGA players and some of the top like 150 maxers, I believe, had attained a 1% ROI over the course. I think you looked at 30 different 150 maxers in golf, had retained a 1% ROI over a number of weeks. He's curious if you've looked at this for other sports and what kind of EV you're finding backtesting your GTO lineups.
Okay, so I'm not going to reveal my actual EV numbers, except the one for baseball. I already said on Blender Show, I think my backtested ROI for my first MLB season was right around 7%. I'm very happy with that number.
Yeah.
Golf is a funny story. So when I said that was in the bad year. And I got to a point where I was just not happy with how things were going, obviously, even though it's kind of a funny thing to say, but I was winning money, but I was not happy because my sim said this was, I was just on the plus end of variance for that period. So I'm like, let's write some tools to look at what's happening in the field. And so what I looked at for that, I think it was for that same bad period I looked at the top 30 players by volume that I had played against.
Okay.
And their ROI over that bad period I had was 1% as a group.
And this is in what kind of contest? Is this like
all
in just
kinds.
like the largest? It's in every
Everything
contest that you played in. Okay.
Yeah. Now, because of that, almost all of the volume is the GPPs because
so not volume in terms of dollar entries, volume in terms of lineups.
No, it was dollar. Yeah.
Okay.
So I did it by dollar. So I just did a ROI over the entire dollar amount for all of those people.
Okay.
Including myself. And because I was a positive outlier, so I had to include myself,
of course,
to balance the negative outlier. And a wildly divergent. I'm not going to, obviously, privacy, I'm not going to say who or what numbers. But that was very sobering and a little comforting. I'm like, okay, it's not. But when I looked at NBA, the high volume players were doing quite a bit better than my sims. And this is not a surprise. And this was for, can't remember if I broke it down by contest type or not, but they're clearly better than me as a group. And I suspect that's still true.
NBA has, I feel like the NBA top players are just head and shoulders above the rest of us. So
yeah,
that makes sense to me. Have you done it for baseball?
I haven't. I did a different analysis for baseball, which is related. Because I'm planning which contests I want to enter and what volume. And I started to look at so mostly I did the main GPPs, the $10, $15, $18 type stuff. Yep. The bulk of my volume. But I did dip my toe into the $250 Formaxes and some other higher stake stuff. And I did an analysis to determine like what's my edge based on contest size and based on entry fee. And what's really interesting is I didn't find that much of a difference across those variables, which I found fascinating.
For baseball in particular.
Yeah, and I think it might just be down to a couple of countervailing forces. As you move up in stakes, the quality of individual lineups goes up, and the ownership gets closer to optimal.
Okay.
But the rake goes down. And I think those things are close enough in magnitude that the ROIs were roughly similar. But I don't know if that's real or if it just happened to be in my sample. But,
interesting.
Yeah. So I will be trying to enter more high stakes to get a handle on it. To see. Unfortunately, it looks like I can't play the Thursday main slate, which is a real bummer.
This week, you mean?
Yeah, because I'm booked. I have to take my cat to the vet.
Yeah, I'll be in DC for the next few days, so I might miss. I'm undecided if I'm going to be playing. I'm going to be playing the Masters anyway. Just going to enter before I leave on Wednesday, but undecided if I'm going to do early season MLB. I don't really want to get behind. I enjoy MLB so much, and it's also the easiest for me, at least. I find MLB to be the easiest to enter. So
yeah, I think golf is the only easier one. The only thing with golf is you have to wake up at odd hours to make sure none of your golfers are scratched.
That's true.
And even then, they often tell you an hour after the event has started. So
right, yeah, good point.
Which I don't really care about that, but I got burned with Hideki this last week. So I think I posted on Twitter that I basically didn't make any changes on DraftKings, and then I full faded on FanDuel as like a little hedge.
You and I did the opposite. Yeah, we talked about that. We went the cowards. We both went the cowards route where we faded him on one site, played him on the other.
I don't know about you, but I still got crushed on the site where I faded.
Same, me too. So it was a rough week.
Didn't really help me out. I had some luck in one of the showdowns. I won one of the 555s, so that was
okay.
Nice. That helped.
That helps a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one more listener question, and then I just want to we'll end up with talk about the DFS landscape, and then maybe talk about your favorite DFS celebration. But first, one more listener question. Travis Scott said that last time you were on with Jordan on your, I think is that the only guest appearance you've done with Blender on the Theory of DFS? Okay, that's what I thought. That's all I watched. But so when you're on that, you said you spoke about some type of content you may be providing to people soon. He wanted me to ask you a follow-up. If it's still in the works, has there been any progress?
Yeah, so I'm too busy right now to do what I want to do, but I definitely want to do something. I'll just trickle out what it is. A couple people are like, I'm really nervous about what you're going to release. Like I'm going to like drop my source code or like. But actually, what I was really interested to do, which I thought would be fun, maybe somebody else will do it now, is to look at to strip away all of the sports specific stuff and just look at some toy DFS games. So really small games that are small enough in terms of the number of lineups, like tens or hundreds or thousands, that you could basically solve the game exactly and then change some variables around. And the goal here is not to create a tool, but to build intuition. Like, how does your strategy change when the payout table changes? Or what do you do when there's a super high value play, but there's positional scarcity. And what happens when there's correlation between player performance? How does that affect what quote unquote optimal play would look like? I think.
So this is going to be like a test that is a teaching tool?
I don't know what form it's going to take. It
Okay.
could be a video or a website or it's just some puzzlers, or I haven't decided yet, but I find it edifying for myself to play with these toy games. So
Interesting.
Yeah, so just playing with toys, playing with DFS toys.
Are you a Rubik's Cube guy?
No.
Oh wow.
My brother
I'm
was into
sort of
it.
shocked.
I'm really not a visual person at all.
Okay.
Like I'm really bad at visualizing things in my head. Like
yeah,
I'm
the same way. I can't do. I haven't tried that hard. Like it's one of those things. Like my older brother mastered it, and then I was like, well, no, I don't need to. So I never solved the Rubik's Cube. I think it was Whistles Go Woo does it in like a number of seconds. So I thought maybe you'd be the same as him.
No. I think my brother got all those genes.
Okay. Yeah, me too. Me too. No fair. But you like toy games.
Yeah, I mean, just as a way of building intuition. Like I've had so many discussions. It's really interesting in various discords where people will ask me like strategic questions, and a lot of them just assume that I know the answers, and I don't know the answers at all. But I'm like, I enjoy like trying to work through the puzzle.
Okay.
And just using my tools, like it's really satisfying to use the tools I've written to answer those kinds of questions. So I think this is a way I can share some of that without like giving anything away exactly. Like I'm not giving, it's not going to make you a winner, but it might help build your intuition.
Teach you to fish kind of thing.
Yeah, sort of. And I haven't really seen a lot of that. Like Jordan's course goes into some of the same things I would talk about, some of them, but it's a different way of looking at those kinds of problems.
Okay. Yeah, I'm interested. Looking forward to it. If you do put it out, that'd be fun.
Yeah, you get into it's amazing how tricky these things become, even with really small games. Like you can create really bizarro situations in Freemans where you get games of chicken, and then you're like, is it an iterative game or not? And is there, do you have to worry about colluding players or not? And what, it's actually kind of interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I've never done 3-man, so I haven't really gotten into it. I know that there's been a lot of controversy surrounding potential colluding, but I haven't really gotten into it or fully understood exactly what they're doing. So yeah, that's something that I'll look into.
I've heard that tangentially. I actually did some research into that for reasons I can't get into right now. It's actually a really difficult problem. And I think those very small contests are where you really have to worry about it. I can't see what the advantage would be in colluding in a large GPP.
Right.
It just doesn't seem like there'd be much edge there. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
You mean like I'm sure you heard about the bachelor couple controversy,
right?
Where they played 300 lineups across 2 different usernames. You just think that, sure, you maybe gain like a little bit of edge potentially in
microscopic,
but it's not a huge edge. So yeah, it's not a.
You
can't really collude.
Yeah, I get why that's against the terms of service. I think that was DraftKings, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a legal thing. Like you're not allowed to. I think that was something that's written that in law that they can't allow people to have more than 150 lineups. So then they need to say you can't do this because then obviously you're
kind of not 2 different people. Yeah, I understand that. But in terms of edge, I would worry about like. I'll get into this whenever I make my content, but you can create a scenario where you have a 3-man, and if the 2 people are working together, you can't win. Dependent on how the game is structured in the lineups, but you can have a situation where that's possible, at least in theory. I don't know if this ever happens in practice. I think my understanding of the actual scandal is that people were colluding in a different way where they basically knew the kind of lineup this other guy would play,
Mm-hmm.
and they would have one guy basically play the same lineup and one play a different lineup.
Huh.
And then if you do the math, and if it's like 50-50, you're chopping up his money.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
I
was
didn't
something
realize
like
that.
it was something like that. But I think the key is they actually they knew something about how he was going to play
Okay.
and teamed up. But you can
All
get
right.
into problems where you could have implicit collusion where those two guys don't even communicate, but they just maybe they take turns playing the chalky lineup and chop up this guy's money. And even there, you're like, that doesn't seem fair,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Even if they weren't explicitly communicating with each other, they just happened on.
But it all revolves around knowing the third player's lineup.
Right.
Okay.
But what I'm
I
saying
never
is
understood that piece of it.
there's
Yeah.
another scenario where you don't even have to know his lineup.
Okay. Yeah.
Where you can, I mean, I'd have to do the math with Rake. And it might not happen in practice very often, but like you can imagine, like maybe in a 3-man, there's 2 viable lineups. And it basically, one of them is more likely to win than the other. So if you're playing an equilibrium strategy, you should play some mixture. But if you're colluding, one person takes the high and one person takes the low.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever the third person does, you can chop up his money.
So when you say 2 viable lineups, you mean like the optimals, like two lineups that project much better than all the other
Right.
lineups.
Let's say there's only 2. I can just give you the example so people can work this out at home. So let's say you have a contest and there's literally 2 lineups you can choose. One is 60% to win and one is 40% to win. If there's no rake, you can collude by player A picks the 60%, player B picks the 40%, and then you chop up the winnings. And then whatever the third player does, he loses. If he picks the 40%, then on average he's getting a 20% return.
Mm-hmm.
If he picks the 60%, he's on average getting a 30% return. But he should be getting 33%.
Right.
So he can't win. And then if there's no rake, we just chop up his money. So that's just a preview of like the kinds of toys I'm playing with. And then exercise for the reader. What's the optimal strategy for this game? That it's a mixed strategy. So what percentage should you play A and what percentage should you play B?
I like it.
So you can puzzle over that.
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff.
I'm interested. You should put this out.
It would be
People
fun.
will enjoy it.
It's really hard to write. I started writing some of this stuff and I'm not the greatest writer, so it's hard.
Okay.
All
right. Give us a like and subscribe so you can keep up with all of our shows, DFS offers, giveaways, and much more. Once you subscribe, hit that notification button to get alerts when our shows go live. Be sure to also check out our monthly podcast giveaway. Just subscribe to our podcast channel and leave a 5-star review with your Awesemo username or Twitter handle to be entered to win a free month of Awesemo Plus Platinum. Well, let's talk about, so I've been curious to hear people's thoughts on the changing DFS landscape. And I think that you are in a unique position in that you do a lot of backtesting. So potentially you have an opinion that is more educated than mine and than a lot of people's. So have you done any backtesting over the years that you've been playing? I mean, you've been playing for a number of years now and very seriously for about 3 years now. So have you done any backtesting to see if the field strength has changed at all over those 3 or so years?
So I backtest every lineup and every contest I do without exception. So so it looked like that was the case with golf because 2021 was so much worse than 2020. And I had a private discussion with someone who I respect a lot in the golf space on Twitter. And he's like, yeah, I think 2020 was the peak of golf EV for whatever reason, maybe COVID and people were bored or whatever.
Yeah.
But now I don't know now because 2022 has been so much better. So I think it's quite clear that in the long run, the EV of all these games has to go down. I think my position is pretty similar to Brick's. I think as tools get better and the average lineup gets better, it's hard to see how that's good for anyone's ROI.
Sure.
So I think at some point, he came to a similar conclusion where it's like at some point the edge becomes small enough relative to the variance that it's just not worth playing anymore. Now, and I think that's correct. There's two huge caveats. We have one. Number one is we have no idea how long that's going to take.
Mhm.
And number two is there is one variable that could change that I could imagine the sites doing, because if brick scenario starts to play out, let's say there's a lot of marginal pros or marginal winning players like me in NBA, right?
Sure.
So take me, my play in NBA not involving late swaps, so showdowns, and if the field continues to get stronger, at some point I will just stop playing those. Like if it's clearly I'm minus 3%, like I'm just wasting my time and money.
Mhm.
But one of the things I could see the sites doing, maybe, because they're not going to want to see their pros go. Like, except for NFL, which is so much bigger than everything else, for every other sport, like, and I don't know if you've looked at this, but in the most of the contests I played, like most of them, the 150 maxers are like a quarter of the field.
Yeah.
And sometimes a lot more. They don't want to kiss that revenue goodbye. So I would imagine at some point it would behoove them to give some rakeback deals to keep those people in, because they'd rather get 10% rake or 5% rake than zero rake. And
Right.
maybe this is happening already. I know, I guess DraftKings every once in a while sends these emails last minute. I'm sure you get them too. It's like, if you enter this contest, we'll give you tickets. And that's because, they goofed or something weird happened and they're underselling. And that is effectively rake back. But I could imagine maybe they're doing this already and we don't know about it. But I think me personally, I'm going to be like Exhibit A for especially smaller NBA showdown, like the mid size where it's a few thousand entries. Like I don't know if those are worth me playing without significant improvement on my part. So
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's like poker eventually, where
Yeah.
the downside for DFS, I mean, poker has gotten a lot tougher, but it's also the ceiling has been raised. So the elite poker players are way better than they used to be, and you have to actually execute live. Like when you play poker, you can't just write a program and be done.
Yeah.
I can tell you those guys write lots of programs where they hire people like me to do it, and then they put in hundreds and hundreds of hours of study. It's really hard to get elite at poker. Like
so it's like elite athletes. Like right now, they're the best they've ever been. Like the NBA players right now would crush NBA players in the 90s. Most people would say. Same
That's
for
right.
DF. Like everybody's just getting better and better and better. And now they're the best they've ever been, and probably it'll keep going that way.
Yeah, I mean, if you took a person off the street and said, here are the best poker tools, here's all the solvers and outputs, and here's $1 million bankroll, you have 6 months to study, go. They're just going to light that money on fire. Like there are very few people who can play at that. I'm pretty good at poker, but I could never play at that level. Like maybe if I worked super, super hard, I could not be the worst one, like at that level. Maybe. But but the problem with DFS is like once somebody creates something like I've created or better than I've created and creates like a push to generate lineup, I mean, it's kind of done at that point.
Yeah.
In terms of
I mean, so I've the only reason that I have some optimism still is there's always going to be a human element, right? So even if somebody creates that push the button, it's still their own inputs. It's not like it's magically coming from these are the correct numbers. This is what is going to happen. It's still based on the variables that they've chosen and based on their knowledge. So there's always going to be some human element. So
yeah,
but I guess maybe people just get so good that still, if the rake is too high, then no matter how good you are, you can't beat the rake, I guess. So that's
I think it's when you hit that good enough point, right?
right.
Like the same thing is true in poker solvers. So there are some games where you can generate these so-called GTO strategies with high precision, and they're basically unbeatable, and people study them. There are other games though where that's really impractical to do because the game space is so enormous. Multiplayer games and certain other games. I won't go into all the details.
Okay.
But the thing is, you don't need it to be perfect. You just need it to be better than everybody else, and then it's over.
Right.
But with poker, you have to actually play. Like you're not allowed to bring your laptop and like
Right.
you have to. And nobody's playing as well as computers. But in DFS, you can literally play as the computer, right? So I think that's the downside to DFS. Maybe they come up with new formats that mix live decision making more, like more live game stuff to keep it interesting.
Yeah, they've been doing the Flash.
Yeah,
there's these Flash games. I forget what they're called.
yeah, I should try one of those. It looks kind of fun. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure I'd get my ass handed to me, but
it's pretty simple. People make huge mistakes. I actually think there's
I'm sure that's
more edge in that than any other contest I play.
Yeah, I think I saw one where somebody was talking about so I guess it gives you options to pick players and stages.
Yeah, it gives you like multiple choice. Which player do you want in? And it's just for 1/4 of the game.
Right. And if you're in a big contest and they offer you player A, and then they offer you player A again in some form, like you kind of have to take them again.
You might have been reading a thread that I did.
Oh,
so
yeah,
I did this. People screw this up all the time where they just like, they'll pick player A, then the next time, well, that player projects better, so I'm going to take him instead. And I'm like, no, you don't take the other player. Yeah. Yeah, I made a post about that. People just make major mistakes.
I could see that, yeah. So maybe they come up with something. I mean, there's always new sports too. And I think to keep it viable, you want new sports and you want lots and lots of variants. Like that's the thing that will keep casual players interested because they have a shot, right?
Right.
They have a shot to win. And so this is why cash games are dying. Like nobody is like $5 and a dream to turn it into 9, you know?
Right. Yeah.
That's just not a thing. So I know people complain about these high payouts, these crazy high payout multiples with bad payout structures. I'm like, whatever gets the guy on the couch to play, that's the contest I want.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's like boo-hoo, you're a pro and you have to fight all this variance. I'm like,
right.
Tough noogie, you know, it's like part of the deal. You have to create a product and if you want, I mean, the sites just want to make their rate. If you want to be a profitable player, you need to have casual players in there, right? So that should be the goal. You know?
So maybe the FanDuel 100,000 a first, 15,000 a second, $600 to 15th or whatever it is. Maybe that's not the worst thing if it's getting casual players, keeping them interested.
Yeah, well, I do think there's a middle ground to be at too. I mean, I was theorizing in Discord, like maybe you just need the top payout to reach a certain threshold, attract people, and then once you hit that, go ahead and sprinkle the money around because that's better for everyone. Plus more casuals who get up there will have a big payday and hopefully, you know, continue to play. Right.
Draws them in.
Yeah, so I did see the ones I think Jordan was talking about where it's like 50, 30, 20, 10.
Yeah.
I think that's great. If it draws big crowds, sure, just keep doing that.
Oh yeah. But I mean that's I think Jordan likes that kind of payout where it's 50, 30, 20. Like that's actually relatively good. I think what he doesn't like is the 100,000, 25,000 a second. And we did recently see an actual 100,000 a first, 15,000 a second. Yeah. So that was kind of brutal. I don't prefer that, but I can live with it, I guess, but I definitely would. I preferred it when it's like 100,000, at least like 40,000 a second would be better. But you know,
I have mixed feelings. I mean, I think the higher the variance it is, definitely the better it is for my kind of process because higher variance, it's just very hard to reason about high variance situations in your head.
Sure.
So the advantage to simulations goes up when you have these kinds of things.
I'm sure.
But on the other hand, you know, I want people to be able to keep playing. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's close it off now. Question that I've been asking, kind of a fun question to close things off. Tell me about your favorite DFS win celebration, if you have one. Do you have a favorite DFS win celebration?
I didn't really celebrate any of them. I know that sounds weird.
I get it. I mean, that's mostly true for myself as well. It's usually I'm by myself, watching TV in the basement with my phone in my hand, and I see the wind. I'm like, all right, cheers. I'm gonna have a glass of whiskey. That's my celebration. But
I do have there's a money amount that if I place that in a single entry in any contest, then I get my wife something fun. So there's that. That's Jordan's first rule of DFS, which is important.
that's a smart one.
I guess the closest thing to a celebration, the thing that was most fun was just, messaging my backer like we just won $500,000.
That's kind of a fun thing to tell somebody.
Yeah, so that was, but I generally don't sweat the games or contests.
Okay.
I had one sweat that was down to a single pot in 2020 where I was like, if this guy misses this birdie attempt, like I lock in first place. And it was like 50,000 for first and like 20 for second. So it was like a $30,000 delta, and he missed it. And it's just nerve wracking. And then another game, I was sweating a showdown on a full slate, and it was down to fourth down, goal line stand end of the game. And if they make the stand, I win solo first for either 50 or 100K. And they didn't, and I like barely broke even. And I'm like, that's all the sweat I need. For me, it's just like a negative emotional free roll. It's like like the negative is so much worse for me than the high. It's
the positive is so good.
I don't know. So
bringing it down, I asked you about your favorite celebrations. You're like, these are all the worst things that have happened to me in DFS.
Well, the thing I sweat now is the end of the slate. It's like, is the slate over? Is the slate over? Can I check my results? Sometimes if I'm bored on a weekend, I'll look at my golf going into round 4, and I'll just see if I have anybody up near the top. But then I'll know which golfers to root for. But that's it. I don't like follow the lineup as it moves. Like, it's just once in a while I'll do that.
All right.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll ask you one more question. So I know that you've done some coaching for poker. Would you consider doing any kind of coaching or content related to DFS outside of your potential toy game? Would you, if somebody wanted some coaching, or if somebody asked you to do content, is that anything that you would consider?
I don't think I'd make a good coach because my way of doing things is so wildly different.
That's true. It's hard to
most people do.
Yeah.
So I think I'd be happy to advise people on just like general game theory questions and like talk through like, okay, we just had this MLB slate. Let's look at the player exposures. Let's look at what the projections were and what the ownership was, and then look at what my software did. And let's see if we can figure anything interesting out about this, any general principle. That kind of thing is interesting. Like using software as a laboratory to learn, which is what almost all of my poker software development has been too. It's like, yes, it's software, but it's software to improve your abilities. Like, it's not that it's doing it for you, it's that it's building you up in some way. So that's interesting to me for sure. I don't know what form that would take exactly, but yeah,
cool.
Yeah.
All right, and where can people find you?
Well, nerdytenor on Twitter. That's about it. I'm in the Roto Grinders Discord, goofing around there sometimes. Yeah, if I do decide to release this toy game idea, I'll announce it on Twitter probably first.
Okay, perfect.
Great.
All right, well, thanks again to Daniel Hutchings for joining me on episode 8 of High Stakes, and to Mike Lawrence for producing as always. You'll be able to find episode 9 of High Stakes next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend.